Hey, this is Tom Bentey, the Tom Bentey Media Podcast. I am here with Marjorie Dehey. She is a producer of many different types of films. She loves to focus on horror films, but she has a lot of great experience in the movie industry. And I'd love to get her insight regarding her career and trajectory and any advice she might have to filmmakers like myself who are looking to produce more projects. So, Marjorie, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the Tom Bentey Media Podcast.
Thanks so much, Tom. I'm really excited to be here today.
So great. We were talking off air and you were mentioning that you're currently in post-production for a film. Can you tell us a little bit about that film and how it came to be?
Sure. The film is called Immortal Thieves, the Bloody Heist. It's about kind of 5 down and out loser thieves that get embroiled in, or basically conned into stealing something that turns out to be an ancient artifact that turns women and only women into these hideous sirens. So, and then kind of course, everything unravels from there. That kind of came about because I think what I love about horror is there's so many mythological creatures and things that people have not explored. In my former film, Bottle Monster, we actually used a real live whip scorpion as the monster, and it was kind of fun working with real life animals, etc. For this, we use more virtual effects, but we try to use as many practical effects as possible. But we work with great VFX companies too.
That sounds really interesting. So there's an element of mythology within your horror film.
Yes. I think there's a lot of, throughout the years, I know I have a couple scripts based on like Mexican horror creatures. These myths come about, and a lot of times these myths come about because they're based on something that is real. Like the Loch Ness monster supposedly is based on a real underwater creature that can grow up to 400 to 600 feet long. So when you look back at these mythologies, often there's some factual information, and I think that's what makes it so interesting.
Because you're taking things in mythology and you're finding the real elements of that, the truth in that, and then expanding on that truth to make a compelling narrative in the horror genre.
Correct. Like on my previous film, Bottle Monster, it was about experimentations done with scorpions to cure cancer, because there is this belief in the community, and it's very popular in Mexico and other areas, that there's a certain type of scorpion venom that can help slow down the growth of cancer cells. So that was part of the underlying story of exploring that. Like, what would you do if you were facing a life to death situation? Would you try to go outside the box, try different things that may work? And I think when you're in these life or death situations, you often think like, what would work? What has worked for somebody else? And you would probably try anything.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, if you're in that situation. So it sounds from a filmmaking standpoint that the plot is very much like these are really huge stakes that your characters are working with.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about huge stakes, because the stakes are always, you always have life or death, but you also have these nuanced lives. Like, who is that person you would die for? Who is that person you would do anything for? And you see these movies and you talk about like, oh, I die for that person, but would you live for them? Would you live your fullest life? Would you be your best person for them? And often it's like, people are like, oh, I give my life for them, but then they don't give their essence and their true self and their lives to that character. So there's always this paradox going on in romances and horror, etc., about what you would really do if you were put in that situation.
But that's what makes it so interesting, is there's no really right or wrong. It's about the human condition. And as we know, the human condition is very much flawed, and how we adapt is kind of finding the beauty in art, I think.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned you filmed that during COVID. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of filming during this crazy time that hopefully we're out of now, but that we were living through for the past couple of years?
Yeah, because I had shot before in 2019, and there was like a different vibe, because you could do anything, you could like interact in any way. When you put COVID in, it created this separation, and I think that affects filmmaking, like not being able to be connected to everybody, because you create this family, and it's hard to create a family if all of a sudden you're like, you need to be 6 feet away, you need to wear a mask, you need to wear a visor, you need to be constantly tested. We actually had a break in filming, and then during that break, like one of the leads got COVID, and then later on somebody not on set, offset, and then it just creates this, like, when you're filming, you have locations, you have permits, you have insurance, so everything's very timed out. So if you lose a lead, you're in this like, okay, now I got to film something else, because I can't like lose my permit and lose my everything, and we were SAG, so we had to follow SAG regulations, which, are, at the time constantly fluid. So you're like, okay, these are the regulations, and you're following. Oh, we're going to add another regulation. Oh, LA added another. So you were really kind of on this weird balance where you had to juggle so many balls beyond the production. So it added like an almost second production unit to do a production. So it made it challenging, because you want your actors to be safe. You want your crew to be safe. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, you mentioned an interesting point. Like, aside from all the logistics of just like following all these parameters, it's also about, like we were talking about before, the human element of being on set and having that camaraderie in the family that only people that have been on sets really know what we're talking about. But at the same time, like, if you love being on set, you love being on set, whether you're an actor, whether you're a crew member. Like, there's just such a sense of friendship and of family and of camaraderie. And with the masks and the social distancing, it must have been very difficult to establish that.
Yeah, it really was hard, because you're asking a lot of your actors, because your actors do have to be close. So you are saying, hey, you're part of this film family, but we want you to be safe, but you still need to be close. So it's this dichotomy where you're like, you want to protect them, but they also want to be actors. They also want to express all those emotions. They want to be close to other people, because that creates the drama, that creates the tension, etc. So it was very interesting to film during COVID. It was very challenging, and we came out with, I think, a great film, but I don't know how it would have been possibly different if we had, if we hadn't had COVID. But I think there was also this thing where you have COVID and you're like, you're in it together. COVID did create this where people are like, I'm going to be a better person, I'm going to be kinder, more wonderful. And I think that's, what was created, the vibe that was created, like people really cared.
That's a great point. So even though that you're separated, because we're all in this together, that adds a level of camaraderie and a friendship and a family. So what you didn't get with the actual physical distance, you got from just the situation and the context of being in this crazy situation and trying to create a story out of it. So yes. That's really cool. So, all right, now you're making these great films, very interesting. Take us back to how it started. How did you get into this crazy industry that we're a part of? How did it all begin?
That's a great question, because I started my career actually at MGM Studios. So I was an attorney over there on the business side of films. You're seeing these films, etc. And you're like, God, I want to be on the other side, but you're like, kind of your knowledge puts you on one side. So I did that. And then I did a lot of international work around film, etc. But it wasn't until 2017 when I made my first short. I directed my first short. And that was like, actually, how they say you have these things that happen and they kind of dramatically change your life. So I had a brain tumor. I was diagnosed with a brain tumor in 2017. So then I was like, well, what's the life I want in the next 5 years? And I really wanted to be on the creative side. So that's when I started more interactively producing. I had done some like mobile producing with big projects and, interactive content. But I was like, I really love films. That's my passion. So that kind of led it. And now 5 years later, directed a feature film, did a few shorts. And this latest was directed by Paul Overacker. And I was a producer on this latest film and the writer. So I kind of took a step back from directing so that I could, focus on other things, because I do love producing.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow, that's I give you so much credit for just taking that stand and taking stock in your life and saying, hey, this is what I want and this is how I'm going to go about achieving it. And sometimes it takes crazy circumstances for us to kind of see our bigger purpose, I think. But I'm so thankful that you seem to be doing well. We don't have to talk about health, but I'm really thankful that, and I'm pleased to see that you have such a great passion and such a vibrancy about film, and you're continuing to pursue that.
Thank you, as are you, which I say it's always fun to talk to fellow filmmakers because we don't get to talk enough. Like we get to talk at festivals but we're always very focused on like what we're working on. So this is so much fun to be with you. And like what I know you talked about one of your projects, but I'm fascinated to know everything that you're doing.
Sure. Well, I'm working on 3 right now, and thank you for asking. But one of them is called The Whisper from Within, the one I mentioned previously. It's a spiritual film about a real life woman who, when she was 13 years old, she suffered a brain aneurysm, and she went from being a healthy, happy, vibrant person to someone who was confined to a wheelchair, who had to learn to walk, talk, to just be a person again. And despite those challenges, she had a faith throughout her whole life. And she was able to achieve really great things and live a very productive, meaningful life. And she has a wonderful family, and she was in the workforce. And I started working with her about 4 years ago. We created this great script that's completely finished. We got great reviews from We Screenplayed. So it's a really solid project. And I have a great pitch video and a pitch deck for that. And then another project I'm working on are more in the series realm. So one's called The American Benefactor. It's my passion project. It's a modern day, very kind of esoteric Highway to Heaven or Touched by an Angel. So it's dealing with people that have struggles and problems and working with them to find spiritual enlightenment through their struggles. But at the same time, it deals with a very a realm of being that's like out of this world. So it takes on the perspective that there are things that are just completely out of our control, and how we succumb to those forces. But it's basically the tagline is saving the world one lost soul at a time. So even though these like little things that are affecting us, they mean a great deal to us, and how we respond to them can really, in many respects, define our lives. And we have to take control over those hardships that we go through. And then the other one I'm working on is called The Caphone. It's a comedy. It's a very much New Jersey comedy about like Italian Americans. So if Sopranos was a comedy, this is what it probably would be like. Very much like a degenerate debauchery type of show where all these crazy things happen. And we filmed a pilot episode for that. It's currently making the festival rounds. And my uncle, who's the executive producer on that, who came up with the idea, and I helped him facilitate it, he told me that he wants to shoot another episode. So I think we're going to do that this summer. So I'm getting geared, getting all set up for that. So those are the 3 that I'm really excited about, that I'm working on. And I just have a passion for telling stories, and I love just putting the pieces together. I love watching films, watching series, and I love, like you said, talking to other creatives that are in the same crazy industry. Because if you're just someone who watches a Netflix show or a movie on TV or on your phone, you don't know what goes into it. But if you are actually there on set, you have such a greater appreciation for all the hardships and the personalities and the struggles that come along with it. So, but I love the whole process. And yeah, it is great talking to people that kind of, at least at some level, understand what you're going through. So I feel for you, and I hope you feel for me as well. But what advice could you give someone that's looking to break into the industry, that has someone who just loves film, whether they're a younger person or an older person, and they just, I really want to create movies. I've always wanted to do this my whole life. What advice could you give them?
I think, there's a few pieces, but I think the key is to do it. I think the technology now exists where you can, even if it's a short, even if it's like you can get your friends together, you can tell a story in so many ways now, where if you think like 10 years, it was still kind of costly and prohibited. Now it's like, the iPhone 13 has like a cinematic like feature on it. So, and it comes down to, and I think you and I both agree, like, what's the story? Like, why are you telling this story? Because I think a lot of stories get told without, and this is maybe one of my pet peeves and maybe one of yours, where you watch a movie and you're like, wow, that movie is good, but had they really researched like more about like either the mythology or about the person, or if they had done a deeper dive, that movie would have been like so much better. And that's what I feel sometimes, that people don't go deep enough into the thing that's driving their story. So who do you care about? Who do you like? What drives it? What's the mythology? And I think, people are afraid to have other people read their stuff. And I think like have as many people read it, because you want to have as many people watch it, and everybody's going to have a different view. And you have to have a kind of tough skin where you're told like, wow, that really sucks. And you're like, okay, thanks. And then you'll make it better, and then you'll make it better, and you'll make it better. And I think the last thing is the film festivals. I mean, it was really hard online. I did some online film festivals. What was great about the online is I was able to do film festivals in Italy and Sweden and other places where, it was just prohibitive to travel, obviously during COVID, but it gave you this whole international viewpoint, which I'm always about international. Like if you are making a movie just for one country, then you're not thinking big enough. There's a whole world that loves to see content. So film festivals in person, fantastic. You just meet so many fantastic people at film festivals.
Yeah, film festivals are great, and it was difficult these last couple of years because I had some projects in film festivals and the whole Zoom thing. It just wasn't the same. But you're right, you get to experience things from all over the world. But I definitely love the in-person experience a lot better. I mean, it's just so much more fun and just more interesting to meet people in person in that regard. But I do love film festivals as well. So you worked initially on the business side for MGM, you said. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what's it like working for a big movie corporation on the business side? Is there any creative element to it? Can you give us like creatives? Did you learn something? I think this is a good question. Like, did you learn something about the creative process from working in the business realm at MGM?
I did, because I think you learn a lot about how it is a business, like how it is structured. And often as a creative, like you don't have much of a voice until you get big. And I think what's changing now, and I think the streamers have helped this, et cetera, is people can have more of a voice in a content ownership, because basically you work with a studio, they own it. They're like, here's a check, you'll get residuals, buy. And that was a lot of how they were treating it. It's like, they would either buy these films, or they said, okay, if you don't take this money or this small amount of money, we're going to shelf your film, because they don't have to distribute it. They had a huge library at the time, so they could pick and choose what they wanted to distribute. And then there was a lot of changes in copyright law that kind of gave people a second bite of the apple. It's a whole big law case, but I don't want to get into that. But it was giving writers more rights. So I think now writers, producers, creatives know they have more rights, which I think is so important, that there have been these big people standing up for, the writers, et cetera. And the other thing that I think is so important now is you have so many people who have collectively come together and say, hey, there's problems with how this worked. There are people who are not allowed to participate, who haven't been allowed to participate actively in the industry. There's been a lot of discrimination. There's been a lot of bad things that have happened. And what I'm loving now is people are saying, hey, no, we're not going to take that. We as a collective industry know we can do better. And I love seeing the shift that, hey, we're going to do better. Are we there? Absolutely not. But are we at least recognizing all the problems that existed and trying to do better? That's, I think, the beauty of being in the creative industry right now, is we are all trying to raise the ship.
Yeah, you can definitely see that across the board. And it is very inspiring to see how at least the industry is trying to do better. Like it's definitely not perfect, but at least it seems like they're making strides in the right direction, which I think is great.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of your creative process, like you've written scripts and stuff, and I'm a writer myself, and it is a struggle. I don't know, like I was listening to an interview with Aaron Sorkin, and he talked about like what a struggle it is. And this is one of the best writers that we have, what a struggle it can be to write. And he said that Stephen King basically works like a 9 to 5. He gets up, he goes to his office, he writes, he comes back, he has dinner. With Sorkin, it sounded like he was almost tortured by writing. And some other writers that they had on this panel that I was watching, like it seems like they're almost tortured by it. And I definitely feel for that. I definitely understand where those people are coming from. How do you go about writing? What's your creative process like? And how do you, like, very logistically, how do you get a script done?
I think that's a great question, because like I'm one of these people. I need dead silence. I need to be by myself, like locked in a room for 10 hours. And that's how I write, because like once I start, and if I get interrupted, and I think this is a writer's paradox, is like writers are almost looking for things to interrupt them, because they're like so tormented. Because when you write a script, and this, you write a script and you're like, I have the best script in my head, and then you come out and you're like, oh my God, what is this? Where did this come from? It's like, what happened to that brilliant script I had in my head? So I think writers are a little tormented, because we want to do the best, but we're almost our worst enemies, because we do that. Like, so I could see Aaron Sorkin going, like, because he's written so much brilliant stuff, he probably goes to his computer and is like, well, what if this isn't brilliant? What if people don't like this? What if, there's all those doubts that come on. And this is a very, I said, tough skin industry, where it's like those doubts can mess with your head as a writer. So you kind of have to like work through that process, and it's hard. It really is.
It really is. Yeah. I mean, the way that I do it, I think it starts with just a very basic idea. And then it's about just facilitating that idea over and over and over again until you have something that's acceptable, I guess. And then you go through that over and over and over again, and you find the real impactful moments, and you structure it. And after a long process, you take this basic idea and you make something that's a narrative story. But I'm really trying to do it more like a schedule, and just schedule time each day to write, because I think that's the way that I best work, as opposed to someone who just kind of locks himself in a room for like 3 or 4 days and comes out with a rough draft of a script. Like that was never really my style. So, but you have to be dedicated, and you have to be disciplined, and it's hard because we have so many distractions, not only from life, but just from our phones, from our computers, and it's hard to stay focused. But as the authors and the writers were talking about, and Mr. Sorkin as well, it's so fulfilling when you get something done. Even the first draft, you're like, wow, I created something out of nothing. And that's what really compels me as a writer, is to create something out of nothing. And it's really just a wonderful feeling. And they were like, it was a BBC radio interview, and they were talking about it almost like it's like an addiction, almost like it's like a drug addiction, because it's like you're in this manic state, and you're miserable, and you're struggling and emotionally, and then at the end you have something that really just makes it all worthwhile. And it's that like up and down that you have to kind of get used to. But it's so fulfilling, like when you actually produce something that's worthwhile and you make an impact and people are resonating with it. Like there's just nothing like that.
Agreed. When you create like one of those great characters, and they're like, and I always feel like great characters are so flawed. Like there's, I'm not saying everybody needs to be the anti-hero, but if you're human, you're flawed. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to make bad decisions. You're going to do stupid things like I always say, like characters do stupid things for good reasons. We all do that. We do like we trust the wrong person. We, do something out of friendship or love, etc. That then when you look back or you tell other people, they're like, well, that was really stupid. And you're like, because we're human. And so characters need to be human, because you sometimes watch those and they're like, I wouldn't be friends with this person because they're too good, or they're too nice, or like they lack the authenticity. And I think, the shows now like Euphoria and all those things, it's like they're so raw. It's so like, oh my God, that's, you may feel like it's way over the top raw, but it's like to me, very humanistic, like that people, get caught up in drugs. They get caught up in these worlds that they didn't intend to, but now that they're there, like Breaking Bad, I feel like is one of the best character art, because you start out with this high school teacher and then he comes like this drug lord. You're like, that's brilliant, because it's not like it happens overnight. It's like you take one step, then you take another step, and then all of a sudden, like people look back and they're like, how did I get here? And that's what's interesting.
Oh, definitely. Breaking Bad is such a great example of that, of how, you take this high school teacher and then he becomes this, it gets so dark. Breaking Bad gets so dark towards the end. It really is, just takes this really dark turn, but it feels natural. It doesn't feel out of place. And the tension throughout it really just makes it very worthwhile to watch. I love Breaking Bad. I thought it was one of the best ever.
Yeah. And you can see Vince Gilligan, how he did that arch. Like he knew that arch at the end. It's like when they talk about TV, it's like, you have your 7 seasons planned out. You may not get to season 7, but he knew. And I always think that's so brilliant about how TV writers do those huge arcs. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, like you had to know that before day one of filming, like where you were ending. And then, stories will change throughout, but it was just brilliant.
Oh, definitely. What are you working on any television? Have you done any like series content?
I did do a pilot many years ago, kind of about millennials, but like set back, like when millennials were young. So that was kind of interesting. TV, I do have a couple TV scripts. They're very, because I have a background, I did criminal law for a bit. I have one that's very focused on the criminal procedure, because the things that do bother me sometimes too when watching it, you're like, yeah, people aren't really gonna like lose it on the stand, because you were so prepped by the time you get to a witness stand that that's not really going to happen. Or you're a really bad lawyer if you let your witness kind of decompose on the stand. But this one is again more on the defense attorney side, because we see everything from the prosecutor's side, because that makes it, that's the good guy, that makes the interesting story. But there's all these like defense attorneys and this conflict that you would have as a defense attorney, because like often, and I've worked with a lot of defense attorneys, your client's guilty. So now you have to, like, you have this kind of conflict within you. It's like, oh my God, this person's a horrible person, but now I'm an attorney. I have to represent this horrible person and possibly set them free. So it's like, they don't ever really get into these conflicts that defense attorneys have. So this is really about, a defense attorney who just, again, it doesn't happen overnight, but that step by step where they think they're doing the good thing. They think they're representing people. People have the right to be represented. But then as, the series goes on, she realizes like she's almost as bad as the people she's representing, and how she gets kind of tied up into this world where you can't just walk away from because of who her clients are. So that's one that I'm working on.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, and it sounds like it's something that you experienced as an attorney when you were a criminal defense attorney. So it makes it all that much real and authentic.
Yeah, and I didn't do criminal defense. I did it actually from the other side, but I saw the nuances of where all these defense attorneys were, wow, this is messed up and not what you signed up for. It's like, I think attorneys are often in criminal law, like thinking something's going to go, like I have friends in the DA's office and they're like, they don't really get to try the cases. It's a lot of settlements. It's a lot of negotiations. It's a lot of, you think you're creating a better world, but that may not always be the case. And I think that's, again, back to our dichotomies of like, you think one thing, but the reality is over here.
And that's where the conflict comes, which makes it drama, which makes it interesting.
Yes.
So that's great. In terms of like the business side of series, like you've made films, but how do you go about, and this is something that I'm working on, as we discussed earlier, how do you go about like getting your project out there on Netflix, on HBO, on Hulu, Prime, whatever? What's that process like from a business standpoint?
Yeah, and I think it's changed over time too. It's like, it's so interesting. I just was at a Producers Guild webinar with Netflix this morning, and they were talking to like, how do projects come to you? How do you get them made? How do you get them done? And a lot of their advice was, well, Netflix is at this point that you have to have representation. And then people are like, well, we're producers. We've been producing for, 15, 20 years. Producers don't really always have representation. So it's kind of this like, then they're like, okay, attached A-list showrunners. So there's this sometimes like they forget, like Netflix kind of came out as, an authentic voice for lots of people. And I do think they do this now in other countries. They have this very authentic voice, but sometimes it's like they've got to compete with the big studios now. So they've created that like representation, etc. But they did say they go to a lot of film festivals. They are always looking for new content. And I think representation, can be found if you're committed to having representation.
So to get a good manager or a good agent as a filmmaker, as a screenwriter, is key to essentially, at least on the superficial level, getting in the door with Netflix.
That's kind of what they were saying. Yes.
Yeah. From what I've heard, it's like you have to kind of link up with a production company that already has a relationship with Netflix. They're not going to see unsolicited material. So you have to basically pitch to a company that has a relationship with Netflix. If they believe in your project, then they can come on board as a co-producer, and then they can help you pitch.
Yeah, and that is another way they talked about, is connecting with production companies that already have the deals. And that can be sometimes an easier route if you can, because they're more accessible. They want to fill up their slate, because anybody who's had to fill up a slate, and this, it's like they want 10 to 15 projects. You're like, you have 5. So, you need to partner to find, because unless you're Shonda Rhimes and ridiculously prolific, it's hard to fill up a 10 to 15, project slate. So especially in TV, because they want the pilot and then they want like a 5-season arc, which is, a lot of information. A film, it's you'd have to have 10 to 15 screenplays. You're going to have to partner with good people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks so much, Marjorie. As we end here, I would just love for your insight in terms of where do you think the industry is going? Are there any trends that you see that you could relay to the audience in terms of new content, or in terms of business, in terms of streaming? Like, are there any trends that you could share with the audience that you think the industry is moving towards?
And, I think this is a very interesting thing, because you see these trends go up and the trends go down. And, there's like superheroes are popular. We want like dark dramas, but then people are like, well, we want more comedy because we were all like super depressed during COVID. Now we want lighthearted stuff. So the trends go up and down. So I think it's like what you do and what I do, it's about creating authentic stories that mean a lot to you. Because if you do that, it won't matter what the trends are, because you would have created great content, like your story about this disabled woman who like is conquering the world. That gave me goosebumps, because that was so genuine and so authentic. So I think, understand what the trends are, but really follow what's authentic to you and make a good story.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. Are you on social media? Would you like to have people to follow you, or are you not on social media?
Sure, I'm on social media. So it's at Media Marjorie 1 on Instagram, or at Media Marjorie on Twitter. I do a lot on Twitter. And then if you want to connect LinkedIn, I'm Marjorie Dehey. I'm super easy to find.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Marjorie. It was great speaking to you. We wish you all the best.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom.